Do you ever have those moments with your family where somebody in the extended family starts talking about a long-lost uncle or an aunt or a grandparent or a great-grandparent and tells some incredible story? And you think, whoa, that is awesome. I'm so glad I'm hearing this. This is a part of who I am. This is awesome. How did I never know this? And it sort of helps you just realise your space and also the care that future generations have had to actually get you to where you are. We're going to do that in a similar way today on the podcast as we've just come off the back of our Anzac Day weekend. We want to have a chat with one man who has got a real passion and heart for those who have served as Army chaplains in the Australian Defence Force. We're going to focus specifically on Anzac chaplain William Fighting Mac Mackenzie and also the really sort of improbable life of the chaplain Walter Dexter as well. Daniel Reynaud is a historian and has written a book about both of these men. They are truly, truly remarkable in the way that they serve. They really sort of started what is, in a way, the chaplaincy aspects of our defence forces now. They did it in a real pioneering spirit and were actually, especially William Mackenzie, at one point, as we're going to hear in our chat today, really a national hero, has been forgotten to many, but was a national hero, couldn't walk down the streets with mobs of people around him because of the service that he had given to the troops in Gallipoli and in other places. This is a moment of reflection, but also of understanding for us as we head into our period of time from a story of over 100 years ago. Let's chat about these two remarkable men with Daniel Reynaud. Would you please like, rate, review, share this podcast with others? It helps us get it out to so many more people. Right, let's get stuck into this conversation. Daniel, thank you so much for the time.
Yeah, it's a pleasure.
Well, take us through a little bit about how, first of all, you learnt about both of these gentlemen and then how you started getting interested in them, and then we might deep dive on each of them.
Okay. So I'm a professional historian and was exploring an area of research interest. And I decided to combine my interest in Australian World War I history with my commitment to faith. And so I began researching the spiritual engagement of the Anzacs during World War I, on which most secular historians say there was no interest at all. And the obvious place to begin researching such a topic was to look at the work of the chaplains in the First World War. And the Australian War Memorial holds the diaries of a number of chaplains' diaries or papers. And two of the men I came across were William Mackenzie, a Salvation Army chaplain, and Walter Dexter, an Anglican chaplain. And reading their diaries kind of lifted them out of the mass of material I was collecting. Their stories were exceptional. And then I was able to build on this because there were archival sources, original sources for the rest of their lives, in both cases, particularly with their descendants. So I was able to contact descendants who were willing to share with me other papers, letters, diaries, family narratives, and that way I was able to build the whole story of their lives, not just their years of service during the First World War.
I love that. You've then gone and written it into two books. The Man the Anzacs Revered, which was around William Fighting Mac Mackenzie, and then Sailor, Soldier, Vicar, Farmer, The Improbable Life of Anzac Chaplain Walter Dexter. So it's beautifully done, the fact that you've been able to highlight both of these men's stories. Just before we get onto them, you did talk about for you that was an aspect of faith that you were like, well, how do we look at this? So where for you was your faith upbringing or your background that you were interested enough to say, I want to explore this part of Anzac history as well?
Yes, so I was raised in a Christian family. And it's always been a cornerstone for me. My faith journey really took off when I was about 16, when it shifted from being a bunch of rules to follow to a dynamic relationship with Jesus, who saved me. And it's driven my life, my values, my worldview, and it's been wonderful to have that as a driver in my research.
Let's talk more broadly, and you sort of mentioned it as well. There does tend to be a broader perspective, especially around our Anzac heritage, of this idea of the sort of the larrikin, the somebody who is perhaps not interested at all in faith, as you said. It seems to be something that's sort of pushed down. Why do you think that is, first of all, before we talk about why you think it's actually so valuable to talk about those who are chaplains and living in the spiritual and faith aspects?
Yes, look, Australia has a general orientation not to talk about religion in public space. Now, we inherited that a little bit from the British, but we took it further. In a pioneering country where, people are thinly spread across a large area, you need the help and the collaboration and cooperation of everybody. And if the early Australian settlers and Australian communities were emphasising conflicts between faiths, it just kind of, it wasn't an effective way to live. And so in order to get on, we kind of tacitly agreed we wouldn't talk about religion in public. And that's led to the idea that Australians are secular, which is a misconstruction, and it's particularly a misconstruction in the time we're talking about, the First World War. It's a point I've made in a couple of my books that the Anzacs were actually the most religiously literate generation in Australian history, because they were born and raised in the years when church attendance was at its highest in Australia, and also many non-church attenders would send their children to Sunday schools in order to learn their morals. So in fact, the decade 1890 and then the following decade 1900 to 1910, this is the peak of church going and of public religion in Australia. All the major newspapers published summaries of the sermons. Books of sermons were bestsellers. Booksellers had trouble keeping up with demand. So it's actually a period in Australian history when Australian soldiers actually had a pretty good exposure to religion before they joined up. So it shouldn't be surprising that a significant minority of the Anzacs were practicing Christians.
All right, let's dig into these two life stories. And we've got two parts of our interview, so maybe we can sort of start with one and then finish with the other. Perhaps we'll kick off with William Mackenzie. Talk to us a little bit about how he came to prominence in the national psyche. I know there's a lot in the book that you talk about, sort of the upbringing, how he became a Salvation Army officer, those sorts of things. If we perhaps talk about when did he actually become sort of known to the troops, and then he actually ended up being quite a public figure. But let's just start off with his work, and I suppose it really commences in a big way around his time in Gallipoli. Yes,
so when he initially joins the army as a chaplain, he's not particularly popular. The idea of a Salvation Army, wowser who doesn't like gambling and drink and womanizing and all those sorts of things. Soldiers were instinctively, no, not interested. But he had a big personality, a charismatic personality, deep integrity, incredibly resourceful. And as a Salvation Army officer, he'd learned how to engage with working class people. He'd worked in a lot of the toughest towns in New South Wales and Queensland. He just knew how to relate. And he applied that to the soldiers. So his time in Egypt was actually the foundation stone of his popularity with the Anzacs. All the chaplains preached against the brothels and the booze in Cairo, but Mackenzie went a step further, typical of Salvationists who weren't afraid of going to the worst places and working there. He would actually go into the brothels and drag soldiers out and put them on the tram back to the camp. He thought he'd probably get stabbed by the brothel owners for ruining their business, but it was just, that's the kind of activism he took. And soldiers had incredible respect for that his behaviour accorded perfectly with what he preached. Not only that, he would go on all the tough training marches. These were designed to knock the stuffing out of fit young men. And here's Mackenzie, he's 44 years old, he's twice the average age of the soldiers. and he can outpace them. He ends up carrying the packs of several men on these route marches who are too tired to carry their own equipment. And here he is carrying his own gear plus that of 2 or 3 other men. And he's fit as a fiddle when he's finished. He's full of energy. He runs concerts that are so dynamic that the soldiers who can't get into the concert hall because it's packed, they tear the matting off the wall so they can listen in from the outside. He's just got that sort of magnetic personality. It wasn't just his secular work, it was his spiritual work as well. His services were so interesting that soldiers decided they would come to his services. They had a choice, usually between 4 services: the Anglican, the Catholic, the Presbyterian/Methodist, or the other Protestants. And Mackenzie was the other Protestants group, but it wasn't long before more than half of his brigade, you've got over 2,000 men attending his services, leaving the other 3 services to split up the 1,800 or so left between the 3 of them. So he really established a reputation in Egypt, and then he consolidated it at Gallipoli.
I know one of the things that he was, and a lot of those who served, we could say this about, but especially for him, he was willing, as you said, the long marches, but a lot of the tough work as well, whether it's, burying the dead when under fire, whether it be the hard yards of what it was. He certainly lived in this perspective. He didn't take any of what could potentially be the privileges of maybe being in a chaplain role to stand back. He was certainly in there the whole time, as well as that dynamism of who he was.
Exactly. And on Gallipoli, well, everyone was under fire at Gallipoli. I mean, the commanding officer of the Australians was mortally wounded by a sniper. No one was safe. I mean, there were areas that were more dangerous and areas that were less dangerous, but everywhere was dangerous. But Mackenzie's dugout was the one closest to the Turkish wire. He was always moving through the trenches, talking to small groups of soldiers. Actually, the trenches was probably one of the safer places to be. The dangerous places were moving from the beach up the gullies and onto the high ridges where the trenches were. And Mackenzie is always on the move. He's going down to the beach hospitals with wounded men. He's then going back up to the ridges. He helps the water carriers carry their heavy and very awkward loads. He's stopping in at various points, talking to men, praying with them, just cheering them up, telling a joke. So being constantly on the move actually makes him more of a target than many of the soldiers who would have, periods of time in the trenches where they could just bunker down and be safe. Yeah. The burials were usually conducted at night because that shielded them to some degree from Turkish artillery. But his burial services, he might be busy through to 1, 2, 3, 4 in the morning. And he would go back to his tent, he would write letters, and then he'd be up at 6 o'clock ready for another full day. He just didn't spare himself. There's one occasion where he didn't have any burials one night. So instead of catching up on much needed sleep, he took a shovel and dug stairs into a very steep and slippery part of the track. Now, everyone would have understood if he'd had a sleep. He needed it. But no, he does this. And it's that kind of behaviour exemplified best when the Battle of Lone Pine is on August 6th. He was ordered to stay back at the medical post, but Mackenzie was drawn to danger like a moth to the flame. It didn't frighten him. It excited him. So some point during the battle, he crossed no man's land under very heavy fire, jumped into the captured Turkish trenches, and was sorting the living from the dead. They were piled 3 and 4 deep in the trenches. You couldn't move except by walking on bodies, some of whom were still alive. There he is in the trenches with the fighting swirling around him while he's pulling out the living and patching them up and getting them sent back to the first aid post. And he spent several days in that situation. At the end of the battle, he'd buried something like 450 men, and he was so weak that he was literally crawling around with the aid of a stick. But he refused to be evacuated because there were so few chaplains left after that kind of activity.
Yeah.
And he wanted the men to have spiritual services.
He moves from Gallipoli, ends up on the Western Front as well, and his reputation just continues and continues and continues with the men. Going from this idea of, oh, well, we don't want this wowser of a Salvation Army chaplain with us, to, my goodness, this guy's proved himself on every single level, and we're going to listen, we're going to hear from him as well. His work there is similar, isn't it? Like, it is constant, it is non-stop, it is relentless in those forms as well. He really just had this ability to keep going.
He did. In fact, he actually should have stopped a little bit more, because he eventually ran himself into the ground and was largely ineffective for 1917. They had to send him home in early 1918. He was just too ill to continue. But every time he went to hospital, he'd let himself out long before he was well. He was just driven to serve. Probably his biggest service to the troops in France, though, was recognising that letters from home were the biggest morale booster, but there were plenty of soldiers who didn't get letters. So he wrote home to his Salvation Army boss and said, I want you to let people know, to write letters to lonely soldiers. I could use, a few hundred of these every mail. Well, his boss didn't circulate it just in the Salvation Army papers. He circulated it in the secular papers, and it wasn't long before Mackenzie was getting something like 4,000 letters every mail. Letters to a lonely soldier, but addressed to him. And wherever he went in the trenches, he was carrying a pack with these letters in it. And he'd meet soldiers from any unit, not just his unit. And he'd say, hello, boys, have you had any mail? And if they said, no, not recently, he'd pull the letters out and hand them over. I've actually read the letter of a soldier writing back to the young lady who'd written a letter to a lonely soldier, telling her just what it meant to him to get news from home, even from a stranger. What a big difference it made in his mood and morale and ability to carry on. This meant that Mackenzie was a legend with the whole AIF. I mean, he was chaplain of a battalion of about 1,000 men. But his name becomes known over the whole AIF. He's still running his fabulous concerts. He still runs church services whenever he can. He runs voluntary services that are crowded. But this letter writing made him a legend across the whole AIF, but also a household name in Australia, because thousands and thousands of people were writing letters addressed to him to distribute to the troops.
So when he does come home, and in that, as you said, that forced sort of need to come home, he is actually treated, I suppose, is the right phrase, sort of a national celebrity? Is that sort of the right description of it? He is, as you said, very well known and treated as such.
He is absolutely a celebrity. There is no other word for it. They organise a meeting for him at the Melbourne Exhibition Hall. It seated nearly 7,000 people. It was standing room only, and there were people who couldn't get in and missed the meeting. When he comes home to Sydney, he gets off the train at Town Hall Station. It's said that his feet never touched the platform between the railway station and the platform in the town hall. He had to be passed over the bodies, the people standing there, because he couldn't go through that crowd. In 1919, the Salvation Army administrator from England came out to visit and had heard of Mackenzie's reputation and suggested to him that they walk from Castlereagh Street to the town hall in order to check preparations for a public meeting. And everyone in the office said, don't do this, but he went ahead. And he was back about an hour later, and they all asked him, so how's the town hall? He said, town hall? I haven't been near it. We haven't got out of the street yet. At the moment Mackenzie stepped on the footpath unannounced, he was mobbed, and the mob stayed there for over an hour, constantly renewed and refreshed by people who wanted to shake his hand, talk to him, just engage with him. And it didn't matter where he went in Australia. He was mobbed everywhere he went. He was like some movie or rock star.
It really is stunning. This is so unfair, and this is why you've written the book, Daniel, as well, The Man the Anzacs Revered. But we're going to have to skip right to the end, especially as we, in our second part of our chat, we want to talk about Walter. But just quickly, this is a moment, and there was a lot of other things he did. There was lots of other work he did, even frontline work. There's lots of other aspects of who he was and what he lived from here. But the question I want to ask is, I think maybe part of the depth of why you've written this book as well is that in this moment he's the most well-known person in Australia, and yet maybe the majority of Australians have never heard of him. Whereas, others, there's from that time that people are aware of. But why do you think that's the case? Why do you think there's this sudden, fact that, somebody who was so well known for such good reasons isn't actually a household name now to Australians?
Well, I guess in some ways he's difficult to turn into an Anzac hero because we've got this mythology of the Anzac who's a young bushman, bit of a larrikin, swears hard, drinks hard, doesn't follow orders terribly much, but is this wonderful fighter. And I mean, even that cliche has got so many holes in it. It's amazing. But how do you fit a deeply devout, non-drinking, non-swearing, evangelistically minded Christian minister into the Anzac legend? It just doesn't fit. It also doesn't help that he lived. This might sound ironic, but he lived for quite some time after the war. He dies in 1947 after World War II, and it's easier to make a legend out of somebody who's not around because you don't have to deal with truth anymore. You can make up stuff and no one will contradict you. So, in a sense, such a spiritual man, such a spiritual powerhouse, doesn't fit well in the Anzac legend. And the other thing is, over time, the living are forgotten. It's the dead who are memorialised. Someone like Simpson and his donkey, for example, who wasn't famous on Gallipoli. He was made famous through stories published in the Australian press. And the stories have been embroidered a bit, and there was no one around to contradict them because, Simpson was dead and his family was in England. Whereas Mackenzie was a vibrant living presence for 25 years after the war, but having died, his story died with him.
Final question on this as we head to Walter in just a couple of minutes' time. What would you say in a 30-second summary, as it were, that we should be taking from his story? What's the message for us today as we, this Anzac Day weekend that we should take from William Mackenzie's life?
The Anzac story and the Anzacs themselves are the centrepiece of probably our most important national story, the story we use to identify who we are as Australians. So the Anzac narrative is really, really important. And it's got to the point where it's almost a religious message. The War Memorial in Canberra looks like a cathedral. We've got pilgrimages that we do. We've got holidays to remember Anzac, like Anzac Day and Remembrance Day in November. Yet we never ask the question, what was the spirituality of the Anzacs themselves? So that's a question I've been asking and have written about in a number of books. Mackenzie's important because he reminds us that the Anzacs had a spiritual dimension. They were interested in matters of faith and belief. They wanted to know about God. They were engaged in life-threatening activities. So naturally they asked spiritual questions. So as we celebrate Anzac Day, let's remember the story more fully. The Anzacs also had spiritual lives, not just secular ones.
So that's the story, well, at least that's part of the story, that Daniel has written in this book, The Man the Anzacs Revered, William Fighting Mac Mackenzie, Anzac chaplain. We're going to be back with Daniel Reynaud in just a moment to talk about the improbable life of Anzac chaplain Walter Dexter and his book there, Sailor, Soldier, Vicar, Farmer. That's on the way next here on Towards Understanding.
Share your brand, your event, your message across 90 Christian radio stations and major cities in Australia and New Zealand by sponsoring Towards Understanding, hosted by Clayton Bielen. More than 210,000 people tune into Towards Understanding each week, and with just one sponsorship, you'll reach this immense engaged audience. Find out more about this exciting and unique opportunity now on the sponsorship page at positivemedia.com.au.
Time now to talk about another one of these that you've done a lot of research in as a historian, Daniel, and it's based out of your book, Sailor, Soldier, Vicar, Farmer, The Improbable Life of Anzac Chaplain Walter Dexter. If I was to sort of, you framed it in that way, obviously from the title of the book, does one of those four identities sort of jump out to you a bit more to better identify Dexter, or did you put them all like that because actually they're all pretty equal in your mind?
The trouble I had with Dexter was fitting all his careers into a single title, so I actually had to miss a couple out. His life was one of incredible adventure and diversity for the first 50 years, and then incredible dullness and monotony for the last 25 years. It's a story you wouldn't dream up. His adventures are too great to be, anything other than fiction. But then having created such a character, why would you have him live such a quiet life for the last 25 years? Yet that's exactly his story.
That's remarkable, isn't it? Because I think sometimes we do sort of look back and we paint it like a movie picture. Well, now, hold on, it's supposed to do this and this and this, but this is actually part of it. Could you take us through some of those that are perhaps your most remarkable adventures of him, whether it was out on the seas as that sailor or perhaps more through the war years?
As a 14-year-old, he joined Britain's Merchant Marine, so he's born in England, and sails the world. And then, having qualified as an officer on merchant ships, he then decides to go to the Boer War as a horseman. Why? I don't know. I think he just wanted adventure. But how a sailor learns to ride a horse, well, I don't know that either. I didn't find it out in my research. He wins a medal there for bravery. Then when he quits there, he goes back to the sea, becomes a sea captain, wins a medal for bravery, rescuing dozens of lives in a shipwreck. Then decides that this life of great wealth, he's making money hand over fist. He decides that it's lacking something. So he goes back to England and trains as a clergyman. And a couple of years later is appointed as a missionary to what they called the Wild Men of Wonthaggi, a brand new coal mining town in Victoria in 1910. In 1914, he joins the AIF, the Australian Imperial Force, as a chaplain. He's in the first batch of chaplains appointed, and he's pretty much the last chaplain demobilised in 1920. And he spends the bulk of that time on the war front. No chaplain spent as much time right on the battlefront as Dexter did. Post-war, he couldn't see himself going back to the placid rhythms of parish life. So he went farming. He was a disastrous farmer. He was just dreadful. At one stage, he sold a cow that didn't milk very well. 3 months later, he buys its replacement, not realising he's just bought the same cow back. Just a great, great story. And in the end, financially, he can't make a go of it as farming. And he goes back to being an Anglican clergyman for 25 years. And these are really quiet 25 years in small rural parishes across Victoria. And I believe he kind of goes, well, I've had 50 years of adventure. These 25 years are devoted to raising my family. He had 6 children, and he gave them a good, stable Christian home upbringing, and excellent education, a wonderful springboard for their lives. And I think he said, I've had my adventure. I'm going to now live the quiet life in favour of my children.
Now, it's unfair. You can't go into his mindset, but you've done so much of the research and looked into his life. Do you think in that sort of first 50 years he was deliberately chasing adventure, or was he just sort of, well, the next thing's in front of me and I'm willing to get into that? And that's sort of just how the bravery came out and those things occurred. Was it one or the other, or maybe a mix of both?
It is a mix of both. There's no doubt he deliberately seeks adventure. He had no reason to quit the sea and go as a horseman to the Boer War. But he'd always dreamt of riding the Wild West in America, with his six-shooter blazing away. And here was a chance to do something similar in South Africa. He could have stayed in England as a clergyman, but he wanted a bit more of a challenge, so he came to Australia. His work as a chaplain is unmatched for duration, sustained giving. That is driven by his personality. It's not driven by his ego. He just wanted to serve. He was actually at one stage given the highest position in chaplaincy in the army, but it meant being locked up in London and fighting political battles with other religions over the balance of chaplains. And he goes, someone else can do this job. I want to go back and serve the men on the front lines. And he actually voluntarily stepped down 2 whole levels so that he could be back on the front line.
We talked about William Mackenzie and the fact that, it involves conducting burials, it involves, chanting and ministering to wounded soldiers, providing those just conversations, those prayers with them, that support as well. And I know that Walter did all of those things as well. One of the things we talked about with William Mackenzie was this idea that, that letter writing was something that was a bit sort of unique for him. Did Walter have something like that, or was it just the longevity of who he was, which was quite astounding?
Yeah, he does have a couple of things that help him stand out. But I would note that, like Mackenzie, he would go on the tough training marches, which built his reputation. He spent as much time in the trenches as he could. As an administrator, he didn't have to go to the front, but whenever there was a battle, wherever it was, he would go. So chaplains had to stick with their unit, but because he wasn't posted to a unit, he was free to go wherever the battle was. So in effect, he spent more time, in the battle zones than any other chaplain. And he was always there to help. He'd be out in no man's land recovering the wounded or the dead. He was twice decorated for bravery, so he's our most decorated chaplain as well as our longest serving. He was decorated for his work at Gallipoli, at Lone Pine, like Mackenzie was, and he was also decorated in France, where in a couple of battles he was just constantly in the trenches, helping the wounded, bringing up hot drinks. At one stage, an ammunition dump caught on fire, and here he is pulling ammunition out of the dump so that the explosion won't be as big. A terrible risk to his life. But the 2 things that make him stand out are, first of all, someone suggested to him that someone ought to run canteens in the trenches themselves, not just miles behind the line out of artillery fire. And he seized on the idea and began to operate canteens. And these were so successful in propping morale. You can imagine it coming out of a trench or going into the muddy trenches on a freezing cold winter's night. And there you can get a hot cup of coffee or tea or cocoa or soup just to revive you, It was an incredible service to the soldiers, and they never forgot it. So there is that aspect. And he also became a legend for his knack of acquiring, as he would say. Someone actually wrote an admiring poem about him called The Pinching Padre, because he was terrific at rustling up needed equipment when it simply wasn't available. And he loved being called the Pinching Padre. So he got this reputation of being able to provide whatever the troops needed, even if the army couldn't come through with the official supplies. Yeah. The second grounds on which he made his reputation was in providing relaxing entertainment for troops once they were out of the trenches. And remember, soldiers spent about 2/3 of their time out of the trenches. They needed that to recover their bodies, their spirit, their soul. And Dexter spent a lot of his time organising and setting up and moving around mobile cinemas so that the soldiers freshly out of the trenches could sit down and watch a Charlie Chaplin comedy or, some movie to help them relax and recover their spirits.
Love that. As we talk about these chaplains and the work they do, that they're often there comforting, they're often there supporting, they're the ones providing that support when, a fellow soldier's, been shot, and so then they're looking after this other soldier or whatever it might be.
Yes.
How did they look after themselves? It feels like, as we tell the story, here they are, they come home, they move on. Was there emotional and spiritual support, that they needed? Was there sort of post-traumatic stress, that they needed to deal with? How were they looked after themselves?
So there was no system for looking after chaplains. I mean, there was no training for chaplains at all. Each chaplain figured it out as he went. And Mackenzie, as I've mentioned in the first part of this program, drove himself so hard he ran himself into the ground, and he suffered post-traumatic stress disorder for the rest of his life. He'd wake up screaming from nightmares in the middle of the night. When he suffered from dementia at the end of his days, he was often found in someone else's front lawn digging a grave. Dexter, I've got to say, not quite as intense a personality, but he had the sense to know that if he didn't slow down, he couldn't keep running. So, for instance, if he could get a little bit of time off, for instance, going to Paris to buy cinema equipment, he'd take half a day off to go sightseeing in Paris. His wife and kids sailed from Australia to England. He was periodically able to get home and spend, a weekend or a few days with his wife and kids. And I think it was his wisdom in knowing how to refresh and regenerate that allowed him such a sustained commitment to the soldiers on the front line under extreme danger. And by the way, he never cheated. A number of times he told his wife, I could come home right now, but I know there's a big battle in the offing and I couldn't stand it if I wasn't there supporting the troops. So it's not like he took it easy, but where there were the opportunities, he understood that refreshing his own spirit was crucial to continuing his ministry.
If William Mackenzie and Walter Dexter were here today and they read your book about them, what do you think their reactions would be to you?
Well, they'd probably both be embarrassed.
Yeah.
Particularly Mackenzie. I mean, he's a huge personality, but he was in no way a show-off. Dexter, well, some of his kids called him a bit of a show pony. But the interesting thing is I actually got to talk to Dexter's youngest son when I was doing the research. He was about to turn 100 with a sharp mind and a very lively wit. And I think Mick Dexter was probably his father's severest critic. And it was interesting because in the course of writing the book, I would send him drafts. And he commented to me, I've had to revise my opinion of my father because you've proved that some of the things I thought about him actually weren't true. And the direction he had to pull back was in terms of the integrity and the effectiveness of his father's ministry, that he wasn't as much of a show pony as he thought, and that he was far more dynamic and effective than the father he knew during the 25 quiet years when he ran country parishes.
It's truly remarkable, isn't it, that we so often, and these sorts of weekends as we talk about Anzac Day weekend, is important for us to reflect and take moments. I want to give you the final word, and I suppose especially from a spiritual perspective, Daniel, as well, around this idea of, here's a focus that you've taken on two gentlemen who were very much focused on the chaplaincy work. We've acknowledged already that during that time and even today perhaps, we don't want to, in a sense, talk about the chaplaincy work as a larger Australian culture. We want to focus on other aspects of it. What sort of moments do you take from both their stories and you say, well, if you had sort of a magic wand, as it were, and you'd like to input this into everyone's thoughts or mindsets about the way that we live life now that you've learnt from these two, what would that be?
First of all, both chaplains understood that the way to have spiritual effectiveness was to look after the whole person. So they weren't scared to engage with concerts and cinemas and canteens, which might not look like a job for a clergyman or a chaplain, but in fact, it's that earned them the credibility that meant soldiers listened to what they had to say about God. So, I mean, that's something we can do today. Are we only concerned about somebody's spiritual dimension, or is it a whole life thing, And I think the gospel, where Jesus' ministry of healing demonstrates that he understood the connection between the body and the soul. Secondly, that Anzac has a very important spiritual dimension to it, and we can't afford to overlook it. You know, if we admire the Anzacs so much, shouldn't we pay respect to the men that the Anzacs admired so much? And quite frequently, that was their chaplain. You see, a soldier had to deal with death fairly often, the death of his mates in battle, the bodies of unknown men on a battlefield. A chaplain dealt with it all the time. There was no respite from it, because they not only helped recover the dead from the battlefields, they would then go through the soldiers' pockets and pack, and then they would parcel that together and label it. They would write to that soldier's family, who would write back and require answers again. And they're not doing that to the 20 or 30 men who surround an individual soldier. That they're doing that across an entire battalion of 1,000 men, often an entire brigade of 4,000 men. So death is a relentless presence in the lives of the chaplains, who deal with it at a much more intense level than any individual soldier did. You know, if we're going to respect the Anzacs, let's recognise the incredibly important work that our chaplains did in helping the soldiers in every possible way, materially, physically, emotionally, but especially spiritually. It didn't matter if a soldier had no religion at all. They still wanted a Christian burial for their mates, and they loved the fact that the chaplains were there, often under shell fire, giving their mates a decent, honourable and respectful burial.
Daniel, thank you so much for writing these books about William Mackenzie, the man the Anzacs revered, and about Walter Dexter, the sailor. Oh, we'll get it eventually. Sailor, soldier, vicar and farmer. Thank you so much for writing them, researching them, and having a conversation with us about that today, especially on this Anzac Day weekend. Thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure.
Daniel Reynaud, my guest here on Towards Understanding.